Hi everyone, I'm Tris, and this afternoon I will be doing a lecture on how to make a deputy speech. I hope you all have access to the presentation already. So, it's in the description link, I think. We put it up earlier. So, I hope while you go through the lecture with me, I hope that you view the presentation so that you can see what I'm talking about and then what I'm going to talk about next. And it's also something that you can download and share to other people later. So, I guess let's go through the content of the presentation first. So, the things that I will discuss later, so I'm going to start with a few caveats. And then the next thing I'm going to do is discuss the structure of a deputy speech, its examples, and tips also that you can maybe use in the future. And then the third thing is an exercise that you can do with your own DevSocs or you can do on your own. And then the last part is a Q&A with you if you have questions after the presentation. So let's go to the caveat slide. So the first thing that I want to say is that you do you. So if you have a better format or a better style of doing a deputy speech, then by all means ignore the lecture, share your format to other people. So this lecture is meant for people who would want to explore new ways of crafting a deputy speech, who are beginners, who would want to learn more, and who would want to improve. So the next caveat is that the contents of my lecture is of course an amalgamation of more than 4 years of competitive debating. So these are things that I learned from my own DevSoc, from my opponents, from judges that gave me comments, and other lecturers as well. So also, I want to give a shout out to my mentor, Mary Valiente, because a lot of this lecture are things that she did teach me when I was still starting out in debate. And then the last reminder is in terms of how do we really make great deputy speeches. And I believe that great deputy speeches start out in prep time. And this doesn't mean that you should grab the entire 30 minutes and just build your extension and not help the prime minister. So what I mean is that in terms of prep time, you should be able to utilize at least 5 to 10 minutes of that prep time to not only build your extension, but also that to make sure that your world, your strategy, the prime minister's speech is clear and well thought of. Because if the model is good and clear, then that means that as a deputy, you are less likely to keep on repeating and clarifying things so that you would have more time to do your part actually, which is rebuttals and then extension, right? Because a lot of deputies that I do know and that I do watch, a lot of them don't have are not able to do good because they spend so much of their time rebuilding, say, the first speaker or recontextualizing the debate, making a new policy. And because of that, by the time they're able to actually do what they're supposed to do, they're already at the 50-minute mark. So, yun. So, great deputy speeches start at prep time. So, the next part is we're gonna go straight to the structure of a deputy speech. So the structure of a deputy speech, the first thing, actually there are three things that you would have to do to make sure that the speech is good and clear. So the first one is in terms of clarifying the debate. The next one is in terms of rebuttals. And then the last is, of course, delivering your extension. So don't worry because we will go through that one by one. And then later on, I'm going to give more examples so that we can understand the concepts more. So let's go to the first thing that you have to do as a deputy, which is to clarify the debate. So in terms of clarifying the debate, there are three things that you can do and that you should do to make sure that you are able to clarify the debate. So the first thing, as you can see in the slide, is to adjust to the frame of your opponents. So basically, adjusting to the frame of your opponents means that you respond to the new or different stuff that come from them, right? So of course, during prep time, in your own team, you've already decided what the goal of the debate is, who the most important actor is, what a fair trade-off is, right? But the reason why this is a debate to begin with is because your opponents don't necessarily see the same means that you think are right, right? So, which is why it's important that in the first part of your speech as a deputy, in clarifying the debate, you do two things to their frame. So the first one is you disprove their frame. So disprove that their goal is the right goal or that their trade off is a fair trade off, right? And then, after you disprove their frame, you should engage the frame. So, this is where you provide an even if to the frame. So, even if the goal is important, maybe it's not as important as yours, etc. So, we will go on later more about that. So, the second thing is in terms of bringing back your own frame. So, you've already adjusted to the debate. But more than adjusting to the debate, you should also bring back your own frame and reestablish two things. Number one, why is your frame the most reasonable? And secondly, the most important. So in Asians, especially, it's so important to bring back your own frame because even if you try to destroy the frame of your opponents, if it's not clear to the judges why your frame is important and why your frame is ultimately better, then that means that there's still a lot of room for your opponents to win. And of course, we don't want to give our opponents more room to win, which is why it's important to bring back our own frame. Okay? So, the third thing that you ought to do in terms of clarifying the debate is to provide the important comparatives and impact them. So, what are important comparatives? So, important comparatives means that usually, in terms of framing, you both have different goals, different actors, and different trade-off, right? Trade-offs. So that means that you have to prove why your goal is more important, why your vulnerable actor are actually the more vulnerable people, and you have to prove maybe why your trade-off is the fairer trade-off. So you should always be comparative. So don't just bring back your frame. Don't just say, oh, our frame is good, our frame is this. You have to be able to talk about why your frame is necessarily more important and better. So always be comparative in terms of adjusting to the frame and bringing back the frame. So, and the next part of comparisons are impacts, right? Because I see a lot of deputies who are able to do comparatives, but the problem is that they don't say why their comparatives are impactful in the round. Because a lot of debaters can bring up different new standards in the round and say they're winning that standard, right? So it couldn't be a battle of just new standard versus new standard. And that makes for a very messy debate. So instead of just saying why your standard, instead of just saying why you fulfill a standard better than the other side, prove why that standard is important, right? So that judges can easily see that there is a value to whatever it is you're winning. So, in essence, don't just say that your actor is the most vulnerable actor in the debate. Also, talk about why the vulnerability of actors is a standard that we should judge the debate upon. So, I hope that's clear. So, again, in clarifying the debate, adjust to the debate. So, that means disprove their frame. But then, after trying to disprove their frame, provide an even if, and then bring back your own frame. And then after you're done doing that, do the important comparatives and prove why the things that you're winning in terms of standards should be the standards in the debate. So I hope that part is clear. Tapos na, charet. So let's go to the next part, which is more tips in terms of clarifying the debate. So I gave 4 tips on how to clarify the debate better. So the first one is don't succumb to their frame. So, this is especially for new debaters. So, just because you go against really good teams or debaters that you know, and they say that their frame is the right frame, it doesn't mean that it is the right frame. So, you have to question if their actor are actually the most vulnerable, question if their policy actually solves the problem, and then watch out for inconsistencies. So, for example, if your opponents say that the problem is urgent, but their solution actually takes a longer time than yours, or they're gonna attack your model by saying, oh, your model takes longer, but at the same time, they also value sustainability. So, usually, models that seem to be perfect, they're usually too good to be true. So if your opponent's model looks so perfect, and then that means that you should look at the model with more scrutiny and with more skepticism. And then after you deny their model, again, you should provide an even if analysis so that you're the most engaging team. So I hope I'm not like going too fast. So just like put a comment on the side if I'm going too fast. So let's go to the second tip, which is winning the most important goal in the round. So if you're not used to doing comparisons and meta, a good place to start at deputy is to compare the most important goal in the round, right? So um, some standards that you can use to do this is number one, prove that your goal is the most important because it caters to the most vulnerable actors. So it caters to the marginalized, to the minorities. But secondly, in terms of state principles that protect the people, maybe your goal is more in line with that, right? Or maybe talk about how your goal is more sustainable, or maybe also talk about why your goal is more urgent, just depending on the situation you're trying to solve. So again, to clarify, if you don't know yet what to compare in terms of clarifying the debate, the two things that you can start on or like use at the start is in terms of what is the most important goal in the debate, and secondly, what is the more absorbable harm? So another point of comparison is the absorbable harm, because a lot of debates suffer because speakers just say that each side has harms, but no one is breaking the deadlock really on which harm is more absorbable. So maybe you can do that as a deputy at the start of your speech. So maybe you can go on and say that, okay, let's talk about the harms in the round and say that your harm is more absorbable because of maybe either one of the four reasons. So, number one, maybe your harm is more absorbable because it doesn't harm the vulnerable. Or number two, maybe because the harm is reversible. Or number three, the harm on your side is mitigable. Or number four, the harm on your side anyway is short term. So those are the things that you can maybe use in terms of breaking the deadlock. So the point is, if you don't know what to compare at deputy in terms of clarifying the debate, start with comparing the most important goal in the round and then the most absorbable harm in the round. Okay. So the fourth tip is in terms of um dealing with definitional challenges. So usually in tournament lectures, they tell you that definitional challenges happen, right? So if it does happen to you, if someone says that, oh, that's the wrong definition, you have to engage. So what are you going to do in the event that happens? So the first thing that you should do as a deputy is engage their definition. So number one, don't succumb right away if you feel very strongly that you have the right definition. But if you know that your definition is actually wrong, maybe it would be better to engage their new definition and say why, even in their definition, you are also still winning the debate. So, right? So, engage the new definition. And number two, make new arguments. Like if you know that your arguments that you prepared are not fit anymore in the debate, then you have to make new arguments on your feet, right? So later on, we're gonna talk about possible arguments that you can explore. But if the question is, but how will I make new arguments? Like, it's not that easy, right? It's true. It's not easy to think of new arguments, especially at deputy when you're about to speak next. But that is the game, right? So that is what debate is about. Quick thinking skills, right? So maybe if you are a beginner, do spend a lot of time reading, spend a lot of time training, so that in the unfortunate moment, and I hope it doesn't happen, that you're attacked with a definitional challenge and you have to think of an entirely new argument. Reading a lot and training a lot will help you to be able to adjust to those things. So, those are my general tips in terms of clarifying the debate. So, I think we've had a sufficient discussion on the first thing a deputy should do, which is to clarify the debate. So, again, to clarify the debate, adjust to the frame, bring back your own frame, and don't forget to do the important comparatives and then make sure to impact those comparatives. So, before we go on to the next part of the deputy speech, which is rebuttals, I want to give an example first so that the concepts are clear. So, for example, let's do this motion. So, the motion is this house would make exclusive schools for the LGBTQIA. So, I'm going to use this example to show you how do we adjust to frames, how do we bring back frames, and how do we do important comparatives. Okay, so again, going back to the motion, the first thing you have to do is adjust to the frame, right? So, for example, government's framing is to say that comfort and safety is important because if they have those, if children are comfortable, if children feel safe, then they learn better. And ultimately, that's the goal of schools, to make sure that children learn better, right? So that's the frame of government. Children learn better when they're comfortable and they're safe. And then, for you to adjust to that frame as op, you first have to disprove the frame and then engage the frame. So how do you do that? So first, you can adjust to the frame by saying that it's untrue that the goal of schools is just to learn, right? So you can say that ultimately, the goal of schools is to provide holistic learning, which means that not only should it teach children how to do school subjects, but also how to interact with people who might disagree with them, who might not like them, who might not accept them. And then, so yeah, that's the frame, right? And you say that in an exclusive school, they're less likely going to learn to do these things because they don't get interactions. So that's it. You tried to disprove the frame. And then, after disproving the frame, the next thing that you ought to do is to provide an even if engagement, right? So you say that even if it's true that learning is the most important goal in this debate because that's what schools do, then we can solve that on our side by making sure that we lessen bullying, maybe by imposing fines in schools that have high cases of bullying, or like punishing kids who actually do bullying, or doing more grassroots discussions on why kids bully and how we're more likely going to stop them. So see, we were able to disprove the frame, but at the same time, we were also able to provide an even if analysis as to why, even if their frame was the right frame, ultimately we're still winning the debate. So, okay, so now we're already able to adjust to the frame, right? So the next thing we have to do then is to bring back our own frame. Okay, so how do we bring back our own frame? So the first thing is that, for example, maybe your frame can be to say that the most important thing in this debate is changing the perceptions of people towards the LGBTQIA through interactions, right? And then you say that the reason why this ought to be the goal of the debate is because if the general problem as to why kids can't study is that they're bullied in school or they're not quite accepted in school, then that means it will be a cyclical problem in Gov because we're not addressing the root cause. So you can say that your goal is better because it addresses the root cause. It makes sure that there's no cycle of like lack of acceptance and bullying in schools, which means that in turn, your frame or your goal is generally more sustainable, right? So I hope those two parts are clear, the adjusting to the frame and then bringing back your own frame. And then the next thing you have to do is to provide the important comparisons, right? So let's go to the first part, which is the more important goal. More important goal. So let's assume Gov side naman for this part, right? Let's assume we're Gov. So if you're Gov, to prove that your goal is more important, you can say that learning is more important because schools are directly made for that, right? Because if it's about changing perception, then let's change perceptions through other things. Like let's do rallies, let's talk to NGOs, let's do seminars, let's contact LGUs, etc. So the impact is that for to achieve what OP wants, which is changing perception, there are a lot of alternatives we can do. But what about the kids who are really unhappy, who really don't feel safe in those schools? There's no alternative for them because these LGBT schools don't exist. Therefore, your actor is more vulnerable. Therefore, your goal is more important. So is that clear? So you have to prove that your goal is more important either by bringing back the goal, bringing back the most important actor. Okay? But then let's go to the second important comparative, which is what is the more absorbable harm. So we're Gov again. So if opposition is gonna say that, oh, you have echo chambers on your side because you just stay in the LGBT schools, you don't interact anymore, and then you can say that, of course, if it's true that there are echo chambers, number one, you have to disprove again. So like that's not true. Like there's still interactions outside, in supermarkets, in fairs, in festivals, etc. Right? But then even if it's echo chambers, even if echo chambers do exist, you can say that the harm on their side is less absorbable, which is kids being hurt, kids being bullied, right? Because if you take a look at these schools, like if you gang up on other kids, so these are usually cliques of kids and they really gang up on you and it's so hard for you as the bully to speak up, etc. So like that's a more pernicious harm because we don't necessarily know how to solve it because sometimes kids themselves don't want to tell on the people who harass them or who hurt them. So yon, just always again tie back to the most important actor or the goal of the debate. So I hope it was clear how we do the clarifying of the debate part. So before I move on to rebuttals, I guess the reminder that I would like to draw and put out there is that there are a lot of things that can happen to the debate. So obviously, you don't just win the debate because you clarified the debate, right? But it helps a lot because the team that wins the debate is the team who is more persuasive, who had a clear case line, and who is more responsive. And I would argue that by clarifying the debate, you are able to become more persuasive, you are able to become more responsive, and it makes what you want in the round clearer as well. Okay? Okay, wait, I'm just gonna drink. Sorry. Okay, so let's go to the next part, which is rebuttals. So I know that for the PDU workshop series, there's going to be a separate lecture on rebuttals. So I wouldn't go further on the specifics of how to rebut, what makes an efficient and good rebuttal, because I'm sure you're going to learn more about that in the next from the next speakers. So I guess the takeaway that I would like to point out in terms of rebuttals na lang to deputies is that don't forget to deal with the best case of your opponent and your worst case as well. Because, number one, it lessens the amount of things that your whip has to respond to, that your whip has to say. Also, so you wouldn't be accused of building at whip or building at reply, etc. So it's better if the response to the best case was something that we heard from deputy, and the response to your worst case as well. So let's dissect this further. So in terms of best case, I hope that when you respond to the best case of your opponent, you don't say one ugly thing about their model and say that that's their best case, and even in their best case, they're losing, right? Because that's unfair and that's unengaging, and any judge will be able to, like, see through that. So instead, really take a look at what your opponent is saying their best case is, and then actually deal with that best case. Okay, but how do we respond to the best case of our opponent? So how do we respond? So maybe talk about how the best case of your opponent is not really enough. They don't get the fullest extent of their benefit. They don't address the goal of the debate, or they don't help save the particular vulnerable actors in the round. Okay? So that's how you respond to the best case of your opponent. And then, in terms of responding to your own worst case, it's important that you don't just take like a pretty, like, still pretty part of your model and say that, oh, this is our worst case, but we still solve it. Like, it would be better if you listen to your opponents, and if they're saying that, oh, this is your worst case, like, really take that worst case and say why that worst case is either one, mitigable, number two, maybe it's short term, or number three, maybe talk about how, oh, like, it doesn't really hurt the most vulnerable actor in the round anyway. Okay? So for rebuttals, that's my main I hope that's the main takeaway for deputies. Really respond to the best case of your opponent, and then don't forget to adjust for your worst case also. Okay, so I guess we can go to the meatier part of the lecture, which are delivering extensions. Because a lot of deputies that I do judge, they tell me that in terms of personal comments, a lot of the questions is really about how, okay, but like, what could have been my extension? How do I extend this debate? And don't worry, because that will be covered in this lecture. So the first thing to note in terms of delivering extensions is that you should be able to think of at least one extension in prep, right? So this is where I go back to my initial reminder, which was that a good deputy speech starts in prep. So there should be at least 5 to 10 minutes for you to be able to think of an extension. So finish prepping for a prime minister for 20 to 25 minutes, because making sure that there is an extension is part of a good and responsible prep. Okay? So there are two main kinds of extensions that you can raise or that you can use in a round, right? So the first is an entirely new extension. So these are topics that haven't been touched on in the round yet, right? So no one has said anything about this. This means that if it is an entirely new extension, it needs a lot of grounding because it's something that hasn't been explored yet in the round. No one has talked about it yet. So you need to spend a lot of time on grounding, on the step-by-step process, and then impacting, right? You have to show the judges that even if it's entirely new, it has a place in the round, okay? And then the next one is in terms of responsive extension. So this is when, for example, your opponent or the speaker before you. So for example, you're a deputy leader of opposition and deputy prime minister opened up a topic already, right? So let's say deputy prime minister's extension was about sustainability. A responsive extension means instead of just dealing with sustainability in rebuttals, you make an entirely different argument talking about sustainability. So I'm going to talk about why we actually win the sustainability issue, why development is more sustainable on our side, etc. So the good thing about this is it's already been laid out. Like, judges already see why it's important in the round. So it's really more about grounding and then proving lang why the difference in methods or middle analysis makes you win the debate. So again, If it's an entirely new extension, it really needs a lot of impacting because the judges don't yet see why it's so important in the round. But if it's a responsive extension, it needs a lot of um, step-by-step analysis as to why your method is so different, why is it mutually exclusive, why can't the other side have it, etc. So, same with the other parts of the lecture. I would say that the most important thing that you have to do in terms of delivering your extension is to make sure that you are able to prove the importance of your extension. Because the thing is, there are a lot of deputies that have extensions. Like they have extensions, but judges don't see the value in the added value in the extension, right? So like, okay, yeah, you had an extension, but the debate could have like gone without it. Like you didn't add any values. For example, like Tokyo and Money Heist, right? Like she's there, but she doesn't really have like much of a helpful value in the round. And that's bad, right? Because you want the judges to view you as someone who adds value to the round, right? Because if the judges view you as important, you get three things. Number one, you get higher speaks, which is, let's be honest, very important, right? Number two, you give your opponents a harder time. Because if you're very good at proving the importance of your extensions, then that means that they spend more time rebutting you instead of building their case. And number three, if you are able to prove the importance of your extension, then the judges are able to see that your case line as a team is more airtight and that you're winning all possible topics in the round, right? Okay, but maybe your question is, so how do we make the extension more impactful, right? How do we say that it is really important in the round? So my tips are, the first thing that you should do to make sure that you prove the importance of your extension is number one, clearly distinguish yourself or the extension from the first speaker. Like, don't just assume that the judge was able to differentiate it. Use explicit signposting. So say things like, while the Prime Minister talked about the important actor, I will talk about long-term effects. Or maybe talk about how, while LO talked about people's perception to the movement, I will talk about why we're stronger on the inside. Stuff like that. So always distinguish what makes yourself different from your first speaker. And then the next thing that you can do to prove your importance is distinguish why the values you're defending in your extension are important parts of the debate. So why is sustainability important? Why is anti-Western rhetoric important? So maybe the things that you can do to prove the importance of your extension are three things. So number one, tie it back to the main goal of the debate. Say that it achieves the main goal or is connected to the main goal. Number number two, maybe it's a way for you to achieve what your opponents want. So say that this argument is important because it shows you that we can co-opt the benefits or the most important benefit that our opponent was promising. And number three, you can prove your importance by tying back your extension to the vulnerable actors. So maybe still, in the long run, it helps them, it adds value to their life, etc. So, regardless if you made an extension that's entirely new or is responsive, if you're not able to prove the importance of that extension in the grand scheme of the debate, then it won't really add more value than we hope it would. So always prove your importance after delivering your extension. Okay, wait, I'm just gonna drink water again. Sorry. Okay, so going back, so the next slide is about tips on delivering extensions. So, and this is where I think more people are interested, right? So I think that as the lecture progressed, like what people really are asking for is like, so what nga? So what are extensions that we can use? So don't worry about it, because on top of my head, while I was making this earlier, I thought of like 7 ways that speakers or deputies can extend in the round. So let's go through them one by one. So the first thing is you can talk about and explore the regional and international effects of the policy, of the motion, of the model, etc. Right? So, okay, maybe first speaker talks about a particular community, a particular town, but maybe you can talk about how this affects other regions, right? So, for example, in the do you call it? In the motion, this house would adopt a national minimum wage. Maybe first speaker can talk about how this makes the lives of people in the provinces in underdeveloped areas better. And then maybe a second speaker, you can talk about how will this affect the interaction between regions. So will people start moving from Metro Manila back to their provinces because like a lot of people work in Metro Manila not because they like it, but because the opportunities are there. So stuff like that, right? So look at the regional effects of a policy or a model. And then secondly, you can also look at international effects, right? So how will a policy of one country affect how other countries react? And this is especially useful in IR rounds, which is why one of my tips for beginner debaters is that even non-beginners, right? Even like old debaters, it would be very helpful if you bring a map every tournament. So like during prep, you just, if it's IR, or even if it's not IR, you just lay down the map. And then if we're talking about Iraq in the debate, look at the countries surrounding Iraq and think of how will they more likely react. And then there, you already have an extension just by exploring the regional and international possibilities and effects of the motion, right? So the next way for you to get an extension is to talk about the societal effects of the model or the policy. And under societal effects, I was able to think of 3 different arguments that you can use. So the first thing is, in terms of societal effects, maybe you can talk about how will the policy or the model change how people in society or community will interact with each other. So will there be microaggressions? Will they be more inclusive? Will stigma against a specific group of people lessen? So that's first. But number 2, you can take a look at how society will create and support policies because of the model or the policy or the motion, right? So will this mean that it's harder to get policies for minorities? Will this mean that people will support policies for minorities, right? And speaking of minorities, another way for us to, what do you call this, to extend on societal effects is you can also have a separate extension on how people view minorities in society, and how do we help them be better, right? How do we help the interaction between society and minorities get better? So those are some of the things that you can uh, look at when you're thinking of making extensions from societal effects. And then the third thing that you can look at is in terms of movements, right? Like how will this number one, inside the movement, how does this make inside the movement stronger? How do we lessen infighting, right? Or how do we balance whatever's happening inside the movement? Or maybe you can talk about outside perceptions. How do we get more donations? How do we get more people to join us in rallies, etc.? So there are a lot of things, excuse me, that you can actually explore when talking about movements. And then the fourth thing that you can derive an extension from is in terms of other industries, right? So, like in debate, just because it's a feminist motion or a feminism motion doesn't mean that you can explore other industries. So maybe if it's a feminist motion, don't just talk about women in general, talk about women in STEM, women who still do domestic work, right? Or if it's about LGBT, like maybe you can also talk about how about the LGBT representation in military and stuff like that. So look at the intersection of other industries in a particular motion subject or a particular motion theme. And then the fifth thing that you can derive an extension from, and this is more classic, is in terms of long-term and short-term stability, development, etc. So maybe first speaker talks about the short term, and then you can go on and talk about the long term and why your model is more sustainable, etc. And then the sixth thing is in terms of principles that are not yet explored in the round. So maybe si first speaker heavy pragmatic yung arguments niya, then maybe you as a deputy can enter with more principled arguments. So what's the responsibility of the individual to the self, to the movement, to other people, stuff like that. And then the seventh thing that you can derive an extension from, and I would say this is something that is not always explored in debates. Maybe you can talk about how will governments react with this particular policy. And this is such a very wide topic, right? So number one, how will LGUs react? But more than LGUs, how will the national government react? How will the executive react? Is there a conflict between the executive and the legislative? And how will that break that deadlock? Right? Like there's a lot of areas that you can explore when thinking of extensions that are connected with governments, right? And the beautiful thing about extensions about the government is that no matter what motion or theme, since these are usually worlds that we debate about, then that means there's always a government involved or a government can always be involved. Therefore, you can always derive extensions about governments. Okay? I hope that's clear. So so I think that if you weren't able to write down those seven things or seven ways that you can get an extension or derive an extension from, I wrote down a simpler version that's more digestible. So I think that when you go in prep, when you're thinking of your extension in prep, there are 4 questions you can ask yourself to think of an extension. It's like a 4-way test. So first, you ask, what about the other actors in the round? So if we're talking about just one actor in the round, or just one group in the round, think about how about the other actors? How will their family react? How will society react, right? How will the community of the actor react? Do they have supporters? Can they get supporters? Can they get detractors? So yon, ask yourself, how about the other actors? Who are the other actors we can talk about? And then the second question you can ask yourself is, who are the other organizations that can be involved in this debate? And then let's talk about them. So maybe what NGOs will be affected? What parts of the government will be affected? How will governments react? How will charities react? How will corporations, especially multinational corporations, react? How will SMEs react, right? Even churches, let's consider them as organizations. So how will the church react? How will this affect the dynamic between the actor, between the movement, between the specific set of people and this particular organization? So yan, ask about the other actors, ask about the organizations. And then the third thing that you can ask yourself during prep is, what about other places, right? So if this debate talks about a particular town, a particular industry, how will, say, the neighboring towns react? How will the national system react to them? How will the different neighboring countries react, right? So, like, discuss the geopolitics around that specific place or specific country. And then the fourth thing that you can ask yourself during prep to inspire an extension is, how about movements, right? What are the movements connected to this motion, to these people? So can I talk about unions in this debate? Can I talk about the feminist movement, the LGBT movement? Can I talk about the scientific community, the medical community, not just movements, but specific clusters of communities? Think about them and think about how they will be affected by the motions. So again, like I listed 7 things with different subsets within themselves of things and topics that you can explore to have an extension. Then I laid out 4 questions you can ask yourself during prep if you feel lost, so that hopefully you get inspired and are able to form your own extensions, right? So if you're looking at the slide, the next reminder in terms of delivering extension is that there is always an extension, right? Like sometimes, especially deputies who are just starting and even deputies who are old, we get so stuck with the idea that I don't have an extension anymore, that my partner has everything already, that I won't be able to extend anymore. And the more that you're stuck in that mindset, the more that your brain is paralyzed and the more that you're not able to actually think of one. So, like, always stick with the mindset that there is always an extension. So, explore those 4 questions, explore those 7 topics that you can explore. Okay? Because if the thing is that, especially in Asians, there's so much room for extension because there's only one extending speaker, right? So, if the thing is that, oh, my partner has everything already, like, I don't think so. Because if your partner has like 4 or 5 arguments, the most likely scenario is that they're gonna argue those 5 things, but they will all be like under analyzed. There's no middle analysis, no impact, because 7 minutes is not a long time, right? So I think a lot of judges would prefer if you have 1 to 2 arguments that are really well analyzed, impactful in comparative, than having so many arguments that are not impacted, that are under analyzed, right? So always think as a deputy speaker, there is always an extension. And if someone has all my extensions, then they're not gonna argue that well, right? So yun. So there's always an extension, always view these things, right? So I'm just gonna make one example using the same motion that we used earlier in terms of the LGBT schools, right? So maybe Prime Minister talked about how, but the purpose of schools is to make kids learn. And this can be a form of justice because for the longest time, LGBT kids are bullied. As DPM, there are a lot of things that you can talk about. So maybe you can form a responsive extension to talk about the perception argument of opposition. You can talk about how, well, this is how we address how society perceives students better. And then you can talk about how will this strengthen the movement. And then you can also talk about how will society react and will this make society better. So I think that in terms of this lecture, the largest chunk that we spent was in terms of extension. So I hope that you digest that first. So the next part of the lecture will be to talk about exercises that you can do on your own or with your debate societies. But before that, I'll just like drink one. Sorry. Okay. So in terms of exercises that you can do, so number 1, I would suggest an extensions roundtable. So for example, there's a motion, like write down a motion or use any motion, and then write down at least 2 to 3 things that Prime Minister is most likely going to argue. And then each of the members of the DebSoc or of the team at least will add extensions that you think can still be added. And like it just goes on in circles. So it's like categories, but this time it's extensions. So that like just exhaust all the possible things. Like don't worry about how you build it, what's the impact, what's the grounding. Just think of like as many extensions as you can. And then as a culminating activity after that session, then maybe you can polish each extension, and that will show you that there is actually a lot of extensions that we can make. So yun. So maybe you can keep practicing how to make extensions. And the benefit of that is in the long run, when you're actually in nationals or in a tournament, like thinking of an extension comes second nature to you because you had a lot of practice thinking of extensions on the spot. So I would really suggest that activity. And then secondly, and I don't know if you do it, but you can also do a clarifying the frame exercise. So what I told earlier is that the parts of clarifying the frame was adjusting, bringing back your frame, and then doing the important comparatives, right? So to be able to do this, what you would have to do is pick a motion and then pick a side that you guys are on. Maybe you can even divide the group into two. So one side will be gov and one side will be op. So what you would do is in the board or like in the G docs or in the group chat, whatever. So you write the frame of government and then you write the frame of opposition. And then the exercise is that teams will work on how will they adjust to the frame of opposition, how do they bring back their own frame, and how do they do the important comparatives. So I think that this exercise is good and crucial because sometimes a lot of deputies just go straight to rebuttals or go straight to their arguments, excuse me, without really clarifying the debate and engaging the framing debate. So yon. So those are two things that you can do on your own with your debate societies so that it's easier for you next time to be a deputy speaker and to think of extensions and to clarify the debate. So I think that's it for my lecture before I proceed to the Q&A. So thank you everyone. So if you have questions, just you can reach me through Messenger, Tris Mapacpac, and I will reply if I can, if I have the time. So yun. So like don't be afraid to ask for anything. So wait, I'll just chat Hexacom. So like I think if you have questions, just like write it in the chat part on the side. Okay, wait, sorry. Okay, so like I'll just like wait for questions, I guess, because um that's part of the lecture series. So I guess I'll just wait for questions. And I hope that you guys always wash your hands and practice social distancing and like drink your vitamins and make your politics inclusive and pro marginalized, I guess. Okay, so like when I reach, I guess, the 55th minute and like no one has yet asked a question, I guess I'll just like wrap it up and then sorry, my question na pala. Do judges in nationals or big debate tournaments usually penalize debaters if they don't give at least one or more extension? Okay, I think that it's a case to case basis, but I think that in so far with the debate briefings that I watched and like gave in tournaments and like even in nationals, like it's part of your duty, I guess, as a deputy to give an extension. But the good thing is, the briefing says an extension in the debate or an added material doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have an argument, an explicit argument. Like responses can be new material, new framing can be new material, added layers to the model can be new material. So I guess judges don't penalize you necessarily because you didn't have an extension, so long as you did contribute new material. But of course, if you're not able to prove the importance of new material, if you didn't really show that you had a new extension, I guess just don't expect that like the scores would be as high if you actually did. So I guess I hope that answers the question. Okay, what can you advise to former debaters who are interested in relearning the basics of deputy speeches? So I guess review the presentation that I gave, the link, and watch more debates. Like it's really helpful. Like while online lectures are helpful, it would also be very helpful if you actually watch debates to see how these things play out in real life. It would be also helpful if you read more, if you joined more tournaments, if you. I guess that's it. Um, mm, okay, so. mm, okay, so someone like okay, someone from my org PM'd me and said that how would you know if your extension is different from the first speaker's arguments? Um I guess if the way for you to know that your extension is entirely different. So usually number one, they address different actors in the round. So for example, maybe si first speaker addresses the actor mismo in the debate. Like for example, if it's a feminist move debate, it's a feminist debate, maybe first speaker talks about how it affects the woman, and then maybe the second speaker talks about how it affects like other families or society in general. Or maybe if it's not about other actors, it talks about a specific theme. So maybe if the first argument was about movements, you're going to talk about governments. So yon, I guess. I hope that answers the question. And then mm, okay, so there's also a question on like how about judges who say that oh it's not different or the conclusions are the same as your first speaker, and they I guess think that you're a rehash or you're just repeating. So maybe to avoid that, to avoid judges thinking that it's the same thing, number one, like I said earlier, be very explicit. So say why it's different. So say that this is entirely different from my partner because it has a different impact, it has a different conclusion, etc. So that's maybe a way that you can do it. Another question is, how do you usually matter load as a deputy speaker? So I think that the reading or the matter loading should be more extensive, since if you are a deputy, you actually have to bring something newer or deeper to the table, I would say, because for first speakers naman, 'di ba, parang usually we know what to argue, but for deputies, for you to shine in the round, you have to know new things, better things, right? So that means that you have to read more in-depth articles. So yon. So parang, for example, if the topic right now is coronavirus, like don't just read how to avoid coronavirus or what countries are doing, like go more in depth, like how is like South Korea doing compared to Philippines compared to US. So yeah, I guess just read um more articles about the same topic and like learn more about specific actors. I hope that answers the question. um Another question is, would it still be a valid extension if it's only principle heavy, especially if the first speaker talked about the pragmatics? I think that so long as you're able to provide the importance of the extension or why is it important, even if it's principled heavy, then it matters. So I think for me personally, the way that I judge is that I don't value the principled versus pragmatic distinction more. It's about how well you argue these things. How well did you prove that they had an impact to the debate? So if you're able to prove that the principle is important, we ought to follow it, and how it changes the debate, then of course I think it would be a very valid extension still. Okay. Can a deputy speaker still have a great speech even though there isn't an extension? So Nicole, so like I said earlier, um, of course, right? So according to like a lot of nationals briefings, like a deputy's new material is not only an extension, but new responses, new framing, new rebuttals even, right? So yun. So just because you don't have a specific extension, you can still have a great speech by adding other materials to the deputy speech. Okay? And then next, is there such thing as too many rebuttals for a deputy? Kasi I provided responsive extension in a manner that like um seemed like a rebuttal. A judge told me that I had too many rebuttals. Okay, I think that yes, there can be too much rebuttals, especially when I think na, for example, 6 minute na nagre-rebut ka pa rin, right? So I think that a litmus test to know that if you're rebutting too much is that if you're rebutting every sentence or every sentence that comes out from your opponents, usually you're rebutting too much. So maybe listen up to the label of the opponent, the impact, because if you're able to destroy naman the impact, usually you're able to destroy a huge chunk of the argument already. So don't rebut line by line, but wait for how they impact it and how it plays in the debate. So that's first. But in terms of judges viewing your extension as a rebuttal, I guess there's no problem naman there, right? So like so what if it's a rebuttal? Like rebuttals are just valid. But if you wanted to really look like an argument, maybe talk about how okay, this is how that doesn't happen on their side, even if it happens. But maybe explicitly say na, but how about our side? This is how it's better on our side. Like if you provide the mechanism of how that particular argument plays out on your side, why it's different, why it's better, then I think that technically can count as new argument. I hope that answered the question. Okay. Yeah, sabi, pero I just felt that it was quite necessary since linked naman yung arguments na yun, parang ganun. Yeah, so yeah, I understand. I agree. Okay, so next question. When would you know if you need to reframe? Like if your DLO, the DPM presents material, is there a way to arbitrate if you need to shift frames? Oh, okay. So I think that um, if you're, for example, if you're DLO and DPM has a new frame, right? DPM presents new material. So I think the first thing you have to ask is, was DPM's frame the same as PM's frame, right? Because if it's the same, then that means you don't necessarily have to do a lot of reframing, because more likely your LO already responded to the frame of their PM. But secondly, if it's super different na from PM's frame, then that means that you can call them out for having entirely different frames that don't match, that probably weakens the case, right? So I guess that's the two things that you can arbitrate first. So usually it's the same frame naman as PM, but if it's not the same frame as PM, then maybe you can attack it. But in the like worst case for you as DLO, na DPM is so sneaky. DPM was able to like insert a completely new reframe and for some reason it sounds persuasive, it sounds right, then I guess you would have to adjust your frame, not necessarily by saying that this is our new frame, because it would look like you're dropping first speaker. Instead of saying this is a new frame, talk first about how LO's frame already addressed that. Talk about why LO's frame already addressed that. But secondly, but even if LO wasn't able to address that, we think that we are still better because XYZ. So gets parang it's more of making it sound like LO was prepared already, but even if LO was prepared, you will be able to still adjust to that reframe. I hope that answered the question. Next, what is your advice in prep in terms of distribution of arguments to the first and second speaker? Because sometimes judges comment that the argument of second speaker could have been said by the first. I think that it's more of a prepping issue. I think that when you're prepping, you should be clear. You should have a clear line of communication. You ask your prime minister, can you argue all of this? And can you argue all of this well? Like, be honest with each other. Because if Prime Minister can argue pa naman and can argue it well, why not? Like, give it to Prime Minister, right? Like, it makes the case line better. It makes the case line more airtight. But if Prime Minister is honest and said na, no, I can't argue that anymore because I'm already building a lot of stuff, then I guess you can take the argument on their own. So, and then sometimes judges comment that the argument should have been said by the first. Maybe um the reason why they're saying that, I'm not sure, but maybe the reason why they're saying that is maybe because si first speaker is arguing a lot of extension stuff, and then you go back to the basics. So for example, like the motion is this house would ban XYZ, right? So obviously the basic questions that we ought to ask is, when do we ban? Why does this constitute a ban, etc. So I guess it would be better if first speaker answers the more basic and more standard stuff first before you go on to more out of this world arguments. Because maybe that's what the judge was talking about when the judge said na, oh, that could have come from like first speaker. I hope that addresses that. Okay, what are the sound bites we can use as deputies when we reframe, when we realize we have the wrong frame? Okay, so like I said, in terms of the question earlier about reframing rin, don't say na, okay, this is our new reframe because my leader of opposition wasn't able to do it well. So like, be very classy in the way that you do it. So say that we think that our I'm sharing my secrets, na charot. So maybe say things like, I think my leader of opposition was clear when he or she was able to say that this is the goal of the debate, this is the actor of the debate, etc. But if the government side is saying that this debate should be about their debate XYZ, this is where we say, number one, their goal is wrong. And number two, even if it's right, we co-opt it better. So yon, like, the first thing you should do is don't drop LO first. Like, say that, maybe reclarify LO, na LO was right in saying this. But because government is maybe insistent, we're still gonna engage them. I hope that answers the question. Okay, hi, is it more advisable that the deputy leads prep? Actually, for me, it's a case-to-case basis. I think that in terms of who leads the prep, the person who leads the prep shouldn't necessarily be the deputy, but the person who, number one, has foresight on how the prep should go, right? Because my struggle before with some teammates that I care and like and love is that I would have teammates when I was prep master na, parang first part pa lang ng motion, they're already running wild with their extensions. So the prep master should be the one who can pull everyone together and say, wait, you're going too far. We have to answer the basic questions first. The prime minister should have the foresight on how the prep should go, can pull everyone together, and can, like, calm everyone down during prep. So I would say that that should be the standard in who leads prep and not necessarily about who is the deputy or the whip, etc. If my first speaker wasn't able to deliver his or her assigned discussion, though I really have to fill that in myself and abandon my prepared extensions in discussion, especially if they're also so crucial. I would say it depends on the extent of non-fulfillment. Like, baka naman yung na-miss lang ni first speaker was impact, right? And like grounding. Impact lang. So like that's short lang naman, diba? And then, but like what if si Prime Minister or si LO, like they really weren't able to deliver the entire discussion, right? So I think that if it depends, like if yung discussion dapat ni Prime Minister answers the basic, like why do we ban? Why is this in line with the state principle, etc. I would argue that answering those basic things are more important than out of the world extensions, right? Like clear extensions. Because like if your extension is deep, it talks about the movements, etc. If you weren't able to answer the most important and basic questions in the round, then you're more likely not going to have much of an edge. So yun, if sobrang important no argument, then I guess like rebuild them. But the third option that I would suggest more is that spend a few minutes re-clarifying what your first speaker said without necessarily rebuilding the entire thing. So just say the label of the argument and say the impact. And another a good way for you to do that is to insert it through rebuttals. So for example, DLO ka, si LO, hindi siya nakapag-argue. Then maybe what you can do is, while you're rebutting DPM, so for example, DPM said that blah, 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 blah. But my LO was able to like address that already when he said XYZ. And then you prove how your LO addressed that. So for you to not waste time, rebuild your first speaker by using his or her speech to rebut the speaker before you. And then you go to your extension. I hope I was able to answer your question. Is it wise to run a responsive case to a question posited by your opponent as an extension? I think, and this is something more personal, I guess, if you are able naman to come up with fresher extensions that are more impactful, then instead of running a responsive case, just put that as a rebuttal. But if it's really the case na they ran a case that you also want to run even before the round started, then okay lang naman siya to be a responsive case. So yan, it's a case-to-case basis. If you have fresher extensions, then run that and just use the responsive case as a rebuttal. But if you're really gonna run the thing that they already ran, and then it's okay for it to be a responsive case. Yeah. I hope my answers to your questions were clear. And if it's not, I hope that you can like send me a message. Wait, sorry. I guess I'll just wait for like 3 more minutes and then I'll wrap up na if there's no more questions. Okay, so I guess like there are no more questions. So again, thank you so much to everyone who watched and who had questions. I hope I was able to answer them. And I hope that the lecture was helpful. If there are things that are not clear, or if you have more questions, if you want to learn more, feel free to reach out and message me on Messenger. And like you can also download and distribute um, the presentation. So I guess that's it. Just like take care of yourselves during the quarantine. Wash your hands, drink your vitamins, practice social distancing, and make your politics intersectional. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you to PDU as well for organizing this. Bye.